Buckeye Classics, brought to you by the convenience stores of Speedway.
Back to throw, down the middle, and it's intercepted by Ohio. It's Griffin, second coming down to the 10, to the 5. Down to the Johnson, and coach, he's in. The Giants got it down there, 10-yard line. The Johnson, he's in for the score. Touchdown, Ohio.
The passing of time provides us the advantage of perspective, to see things more clearly, to mark the moments that shape the future. The history of Ohio State football is filled with a grand collection of glorious moments, of games, players, and coaches that have changed the face of college football. The 1968 game against number 1 Purdue was one of those moments. This is that story.
Ohio State's 1968 victory over top-ranked Purdue is perhaps the greatest win in the history of Ohio State football.
When we left that field after winning that game, I don't think anybody knew whether their feet were touching the ground or not.
That was the greatest feeling that I've ever had.
People were so happy, they were just rejoicing, they were talking with each other, strangers were talking with strangers.
I've never felt a crowd like this crowd. It seemed to me they were standing the entire game.
It was like probably a 10 on a Richter scale.
This is the preseason rated number 1 team. They've got Leroy Keys, they got Mike Phipps, and at that time they had a monstrous offensive and defensive line.
This game defined everything for us. It gave us our identity.
You know, it was just a special day.
The win was a springboard to the national championship and to a season that still reverberates in the hearts of Buckeye fans everywhere. It was also the beginning of a new era of excellence, a period which saw the Buckeyes win 9 Big Ten titles in 10 years, with some of college football's greatest players. But the championship age born that day was never assured. In fact, just 1 year before, the Buckeyes were in disarray, and Coach Woody Hayes was under fire.
Now, there was a 13-game period there from 1966 through the first part of 1967, where in those 13 games, Ohio State lost 8 of those games. In fact, of those 8 losses, 4 of those losses were 4 straight losses at home, and Woody Hayes is in a little bit of trouble.
There was a lot of pressure and a lot of criticism about Woody, even to the point that the game had passed him by and the planes would fly around the stadium, bye-bye Woody.
We always assumed that Woody was above anything, that Woody was beyond being touched. But you couldn't ignore the signs.
That was difficult, and especially to have the banners and people singing and chanting, "Goodbye, Woody, we hate to see you go." That was not, well, it's not fair.
It got to the point late in '66 and early in the '67 season. I can't go into the details, it was so bad. It was, the best thing, it was ugly.
The flagging Buckeye fortunes were the result of a controversial 1961 vote by the university's faculty council that prevented the Big Ten champion Buckeyes from going to the Rose Bowl.
That decision by the Ohio State Faculty Council to vote down going to the Rose Bowl, there's no question that really unfavorably affected Hayes' ability to recruit in the state of Ohio.
It did hurt recruiting because there were coaches around the Big Ten who would say you don't want to go to Ohio State because you never know whether if they win the Big Ten, whether they're going to be able to go to the Rose Bowl or not because of the feeling between the faculty and the athletic department.
By 1966, the fallout from the Rose Bowl vote was felt on the field, and the Buckeyes limped to a 4-5 record, only the second losing season in 15 years for Coach Hayes. Woody realized a new approach was needed to lure top-flight talent to Columbus.
Hayes changes his strategy, and that is he's going to recruit on much more of a national basis. Well, that produced tremendous results in the 1967 freshman team. Players like Jack Tatum, John Brockington, Bruce Jankowski, Timmy Anderson, all brought in from other states to become part of what a lot of people consider maybe the greatest freshman team ever assembled.
You could go across the line through the backfield, offense and defense, and there were all Ohioans, high school All-Americans at almost every position.
It was kind of being built up. And so we had a lot of credibility coming into 1967, and there was a lot of excitement.
You can read the press clippings and the guys, and look into a guy's eye and see just as well as I can. If he's got the look of Eagles, you're going, oh yeah, we got something here.
But in 1967, freshmen were ineligible to play varsity football, and that excitement was put on hold. In the meantime, the 67 Buckeyes were off to a terrible start.
Purdue really beat us badly, and then we had the homecoming game with Illinois, and we lost. And at that point in the season, we were 2-3. And you don't lose to Illinois, you don't lose at home, and obviously you don't lose the homecoming game.
The mounting defeats made fans restless, and the calls for Woody's job grew louder.
In 1967, they were hanging Woody in effigy at the corner of 15th and High.
If you don't win at Ohio State, you're going to have plenty of heat, and you're going to have airplanes flying around the stadium, and you're going to have all kinds of stuff like that.
I remember Ann Hayes carrying a Goodbye Woody sign. I'm thinking, wow, this is pretty tough. You know, the guy's wife is saying goodbye.
With his program teetering on the brink of collapse, Woody dug in.
Hayes called his staff together after the 5th game and pretty well told them that if we win out, we probably have a pretty good chance of keeping our job. But if the season continues, he felt there was a good chance that he would be relieved of his coaching position and that probably most of the assistants would need to find some jobs elsewhere.
The next week we went to Michigan State. We won up there, and after the game I remember Coach Hayes coming into the locker room and saying this was the most important game of his coaching career, and we knew then his job was probably on the line.
Ohio State went on to win the rest of their games, including a 24-14 win over Michigan. But the early season losses, especially to Purdue, lingered in the hearts of the team.
We sat in the stands and watched that Purdue game as freshmen when they came into our house and beat us 41-6. I still remember the score because I had never been a part of a game in my career that was that lopsided.
That was a bad day. I remember going into the locker room and our quarterback coach jumped in my face and he said, "Rex, remember about this game." He said, "That's what we're playing for next year." And he said, "Don't let that ever happen to us again. And don't get embarrassed like that in that stadium."
Redemption was 1 year away. The 1968 Ohio State football season opened with victories over SMU and Oregon. In the starting lineup were 14 sophomores from Woody Hayes' heralded 1967 recruiting class. Their much anticipated arrival had raised the hopes of the Buckeye faithful.
With the recruiting class that Woody had in 1968, even the doubting Thomases were beginning to say, here's a team that could go all the way, because he had the greatest alignment of talent for that 1968 season that I think they've ever had at one time at Ohio State University.
But that optimism and the players who created it were about to face their first real test. The Purdue Boilermakers, the nation's #1 team. Purdue arrived in Columbus led by two of the game's most exciting players, All-American quarterback Mike Phipps and running back Leroy Keys, the preseason favorite for the Heisman Trophy. Just 1 year earlier, Purdue had pummeled the Buckeyes 41-6 in the Horseshoe, and most fans felt the promising but unproven sophomores were still a year away. Oddsmakers agreed and rated the Boilermakers a 13-point favorite, a role they relished.
Purdue was they were talking a lot of trash. Leroy Keys, great athlete, said when he went back after that game, they beat him real bad, that he didn't even feel like he was in a football game.
He had been quoted as saying he didn't think there was anybody in college football that could cover him one-on-one.
We felt that this was a different football team. We had some defensive backs. We had a guy in Zach Tatum that could cover anybody in the country. So we were confident going into the game that, hey, this is a different football team, this is a different day, and you're on our home turf, and we like to play in the Horseshoe.
The Buckeyes were determined to prove that difference right from the start.
Woody felt that the Purdue linemen were slow and out of shape, and we went with no huddle offense on the first series we had the ball.
We were calling plays in huddle, 3 at a time, and we were just running right at them.
John Brockington's second down sprint around left end set the tone immediately. Their fast-paced opening drive took them deep inside Purdue territory. But when the drive stalled at the Boilermaker 4, the field goal team came in.
The ball is towed down, the kick is up, and it is no good, wide to the right, and that could be an important miss.
Erratic kicking, a season-long nemesis, would plague the Buckeyes the rest of the day. But Ohio State's opening drive sent the Boilers a clear message you're in for a game. It also showcased Woody's willingness to add new wrinkles, something his assistants had pushed for in the offseason.
That spring, they changed the entire offense. We went to a slot-eye offense in '68 that was nothing like Woody ever had.
It was really counter football to what Ohio State has been known for. We spread the field, threw the ball, spread it out, used sideline to sideline. It really caught a lot of people by surprise.
The changes were proposed by quarterbacks coach George Champ, whose ideas initially found resistance.
There's a few stories about the assistant coaches fighting with Woody about changing the offense, and there's projectors flying through meeting room windows and coaches getting fired because they're arguing their point about it. And then Woody calms down and calls the coaches back, and they talk about it a little bit more, and then Woody, as the story goes, well, damn it, we'll give it a try.
It was different and it was exciting. It proved that the coach wasn't closed-minded, that he'd take a good suggestion from wherever it came.
It was an outstanding offense, and the old man did warm up to it.
That optimism was infectious, and the team quickly became believers.
During practice, you can start seeing some things happen and start developing an attitude that, hey, we can win. We can win against anybody we come up against. We got a lot of weapons here. We got a lot of tools.
It was just a different spirit about that whole team, and I think in the coaching staff, too.
The new look, new attitude Buckeyes were now looking to settle old scores. The new style offense had the Boilermakers on their heels, but critical errors kept the Buckeyes off the scoreboard. Passes sailed high, field goals strayed wide. When the half ended, the teams were tied at 0. But inside the locker room, the Buckeyes' spirits were high.
Woody didn't really have to give us a pep talk there at halftime. We probably didn't want to go in at halftime. We wanted to keep playing.
We felt like we were ahead of the game because last year was, who knows, 38-0? I can't remember at halftime. It was horrible.
It was not that we're hanging with these guys. Hey, we're beating them. We got them on the run, guys. We just need to put the ball in the end zone.
To bring down the Boilermakers, the Buckeyes needed a big play. The game's big break was just minutes away.
The Woody Hayes era of Ohio State football kicked off on September 29, 1951, with a 7-0 win over a stubborn Southern Methodist team at Ohio Stadium. Hayes Buckeyes finished the 51 season with a 4-3-2 record. By the end of his 28-year career, however, Woody had won 205 games, 13 Big Ten titles, and 3 national championships. Buckeye Classics, brought to you by the convenience stores of Speedway.
As the second half of the 1968 Ohio State-Purdue game kicked off, the young upstart Buckeyes looked to break the deadlock of a scoreless first half. The turning point came quickly.
On the fourth play of the third quarter, one of the most memorable plays in all of Ohio State football was about to happen.
Formation. Again, Phipps going back to throw. He has time. He throws. It's intercepted by Provost, and he's going in for touchdown. Touchdown, Ohio. Provost scores.
The stadium erupted. The bench erupted. That was enough for us to win the football game.
Provost intercepted the pass on about the 30-yard line.
That was it.
It was a tremendous boost. I mean, that stadium was just moving. I don't think it stopped all season.
The play was the result of a special defensive scheme installed weeks before, just for Purdue.
We had a special defense where, and they left it to me and Provost. We could call it when we wanted to, and it was called Robert, and Teddy and I would just exchange positions on certain plays, and we'd do it at the snap of the ball.
Well, the second play of the second half, they threw the outcut, and I want to tell you, Jack Tatum had that sucker in his hand, and he drops it.
The next play, we called direct the defense, and he was thinking we were going to run the same defense, so he made the throw, and Teddy just stepped in it perfectly and just took it in.
Basically, you dream about this stuff, getting that flat pass where, nobody's in front of you and it's straight down the sideline. It just happened to be the play that we were looking for.
And they mob Provost down there.
That kind of turned the game around right there.
2 series later, the Buckeye defense did it again.
And they've spread them out all over the field as Phipps goes back to throw. He throws it, and it's intercepted by Ohio. Stillwagon. Stillwagon intercepts. Jim Stillwagon.
From the Purdue 25, the Buckeye offense went to work. 3 carries by fullback Jim Otis moved the ball to the Purdue 8. A Buckeye touchdown seemed certain, but then disaster struck.
And it's Kern sweeping wide to his right, but he can't do it. They catch him from behind. And Kern is a little slow getting up.
And there are a couple of big guys coming in there on Rex, and Rex was obviously shaken up.
With Kern on the sideline, Woody faced a decision. Should he put in second-teamer Ron Masajowski, just a sophomore, or go with senior Billy Long, the starting quarterback the previous 2 seasons? Woody opted for experience and called Long's number, much to the crowd's dismay.
There was a large contingent of booing when I came in that game. They wanted Masajowski, understandably.
We were all surprised to see Bill Long come in too. But I guess Woody wanted a guy that he felt could go right in there and just feel at home.
We all had trepidation when he came in. We just thought, oh boy, it's curtains.
Faced with the 3rd and goal, the record crowd of over 85,000 watched Billy Long make his run into Buckeye lore.
In the 3rd period, a tight T. Billy Long, the quarterback. Billy Long going back to throw. He's looking now. Now he decides to run. He's at the 10, the 5, the 4. He's in. He scores. Billy Long scores for Ohio. A 14-yard touchdown run.
Here was a guy that had set passing records the 2 previous years and wound up when the season started as the 3rd-string quarterback.
It was a tough time for me up until that moment in this year. And I did feel, in retrospect, I like to call it a more sense of belonging, because I was feeling isolated at that point. And then this made me feel, really now part of this team, and a little bit of a sense of vindication.
I think that was the greatest highlight of his life right there. You could tell when he came off the field. His big smile on his face.
To cap off the excitement, the Buckeyes converted the extra point, their only successful kick of the day. Momentum was now completely with the Buckeyes, but there was still over a quarter to play.
But there was still, believe me, a sense this game wasn't over. This was still the 3rd quarter, and we were playing against the #1 offensive team in the country.
The Buckeye defense, already smothering, turned up the volume.
The defense was, they were whacking people. The whooping that they took last year, they was giving it back.
Jack Tatum in particular was a force. Given the assignment of shadowing Leroy Keys, Tatum responded with an historic effort.
And I think anybody that was in Ohio Stadium that day or saw that game on television will never, ever forget the play of Jack Tatum.
If Leroy Keys is super, Jack Tatum is a super.
He was the greatest football player I've ever seen. When Tatum took 2 steps, he was in full stride. When he hit you, he ran through you. He ran over you. It was like a Mack truck hitting you.
Tatum's climax came in the 4th quarter, when his sack of Mike Phipps sent the Purdue All-American to the bench. With Phipps out of the game and Keys shut down, all that remained was the sound of the final gun.
And the ball game is over. Ohio wins it, 13-0. The biggest upset of the season. The Buckeyes win it, defeating the Boilermakers of Purdue, and there's pandemonium going on the field. They're coming out of the stands. They're coming off the bench.
After that game and beating the #1 team, we knew we were on our way.
We knew then that all we had to do was perform as we did here. Practice like we did to get ready for this game. And every game that we'd have, nobody could touch us.
The victory over Purdue was a watershed event in the course of Buckeye history. It was a launching pad to the national championship and a vindication for Coach Woody Hayes. It was a game for the ages and a turning point for a team playing in troubled times. It was also the birth of a new era, an age of excellence and excitement that has endured for over 30 years, an era whose end is not in sight.
Woody Hayes was known as a fiery, emotional leader who would stop at nothing to gain an edge. In the 1968 battle against Purdue, Hayes enlisted the services of Marine Commander General Lewis Walt to give his team a halftime pep talk. Now, did the general's words inspire the Buckeyes to victory? Probably not. For even Woody knew that no amount of shouting could ever replace the three components it takes to win: blocking, tackling, and execution. For Buckeye Classics, I'm Archie Griffin. Thanks for watching.
For the most up-to-date Buckeye information on all 35 varsity sports, log on to the official website of the Ohio State Department of Athletics, ohiostatebuckeyes.com.
The Buckeye Hall of Fame Cafe is proud to support Buckeye Classics. Buckeye Classics, brought to you by the convenience stores of Speedway.
When most football fans hear the name Paul Brown, the first thing they think of is professional football, the Cleveland Browns or the Cincinnati Bengals. But before Woody Hayes, before the Super Sophomores, and before Eddie George, there was a coach who revolutionized the way football was played. That coach was Paul Brown, and Paul Brown was a Buckeye.
Paul Brown is a true giant of American football. His impact on the history and development of the game cannot be overstated. He was an innovator, a pioneer, and a legend in his own time.
He did a lot of things before anybody else did them. People are still doing things the way he did it.
He did so many things to revolutionize the game as we know it today, that had it not been for a Paul Brown, we might still be back in the Stone Age.
A genius, an innovator, a man who established a blueprint that everyone follows today.
He won championships at every level: high school, college, professional, and created a legacy of excellence that seared his essence into the soul of the game.
He was a very driven man and a very smart man.
God, what a mind he had, and of course, he proved it everywhere he went.
He was the father of American football, particularly professional football.
We continue to keep trying to get better and better because of the example that Paul Brown set.
Paul Brown was born September 11, 1908 in Norwalk, Ohio, the eldest child of Lester and Ida Brown. Lester Brown was a dispatcher with the Wheeling and Lake Erie Railroad and was known for his meticulous and studious nature.
His father was a very dedicated person. He was a reader. He spent a lot of time at the library, and of course everything ran on a schedule. And you had to have a schedule for everything. You were organized. You never were a minute early or a minute late. And I think that Paul inherited a lot of that.
When Paul was 9, his father was transferred to the small, hard-working town of Massillon. For a young boy who loved football, Massillon, Ohio was the perfect place for inspiration.
One of his real childhood heroes was a man about 10 years older than him that was a star quarterback in Massillon by the name of Harry Struhl there. Harry became very famous as the quarterback of the Four Horsemen backfield at Notre Dame under Newt Rockne in 1924 and went on to become a head coach at the University of Wisconsin.
Brown was determined to follow in Stoldrer's footsteps, and by his junior year, he earned the job as Massillon's quarterback. After high school, Brown enrolled at Ohio State, but his diminutive size barred him from being a Buckeye.
When he came into Ohio State as a freshman, he weighed only about 135 pounds. That was really too small to play Big Ten football, so from there he went to Miami of Ohio and became a pretty good quarterback. He made up for his lack of size by studying the game and just becoming very hard-nosed and just became a very, very determined young man.
Brown was a committed student as well, and his high marks qualified him for a Rhodes Scholarship after graduation. His father wanted him to become a lawyer, but with the nation in the throes of the Great Depression, and now newly wed, Brown followed his heart and went straight to work, coaching football. Brown's first job was at the Severn School in Maryland, and his 2-year record of 16-1-1 opened the door to his first big opportunity.
Massillon High School, where he had grown up, offered him the opportunity to come back there as the head football coach of Massillon Washington High School.
Brown accepted the job and returned home as the head coach of his beloved alma mater. It was 1932. He was just 23 years old. In his first 3 seasons, Brown's Tigers went an impressive 24-7-1. But that record was just a hint of things to come. From 1935 to 1940, the Massillon Tigers went 58-1-1 and won 6 consecutive Ohio high school championships. By his 9th season, Brown had his Tigers perched on the peak of perfection.
Paul Brown's 1940 team not only defeated all 10 of its opponents, but it outscored its opponents 477-6.
The 1940 team was Massillon's 4th in 6 seasons to be recognized as national high school champions. Meanwhile, in Columbus, Ohio State's 1940 season was ending badly. The Buckeyes finished a disappointing season with a humiliating 40-0 loss to Michigan. 3 weeks later, head coach Francis Smith resigned under pressure. A national search was begun, but a call went up from around the state. Hire Paul Brown.
The Ohio State Athletic Board, as well as Governor Bricker, received over 500 letters unsolicited from various high school coaches around the state of Ohio in favor of Paul Brown. It was just a landslide. The newspapers got behind it. There were editorials in all the newspapers around the state that we have the best candidate for the Ohio State coaching job right here in Ohio.
The tidal wave of support could not be ignored, and athletic director L.W. St. John granted Brown an interview. Brown wowed St. John and the rest of the selection committee. He was their unanimous choice, even though he was the only candidate with no collegiate coaching experience. Just 32 years old, Paul Brown was given the reins to one of college football's most powerful and prestigious programs, Ohio State. By 1940, Paul Brown was widely hailed as the greatest high school coach in the history of American football. But some skeptics wondered whether the 32-year-old man from Massillon was capable of coaching one of college football's premier teams, the Ohio State Buckeyes. Brown's predecessor, Francis Smith, won 2 Big Ten titles in 7 seasons, but his freewheeling style was seen by some as a liability.
Practices sometimes under Schmidt would last 3.5 hours. They were somewhat disorganized. The assistant coaches didn't play a big part in some of the practices. It really were a lot of the players standing around. So I think towards the end of Schmidt's career, this had maybe worn a little bit of thin. His maybe a little bit of lack of organization.
Paul Brown was the antithesis of Francis Smith, and he wasted little time letting his new players know exactly what he expected from them.
He called a meeting right away for the whole squad, and right then he set down what he wanted to do and the discipline and the rest of it, and he meant business. You weren't going to challenge him, that's for sure.
He didn't look like a football coach to me, but when you looked into those beady eyes that he had, you knew something was in that head of his.
The man had a kind of presence. He had a kind of aura about him. So that when he started to talk, you listened.
Brown's insistence on discipline and organization was the bedrock to his brand of football, a game that relied on brains as much as brawn.
He wanted them to be extremely intelligent. He wanted these players, as he would often say, to be lean and hungry. Speed was a big part of his both offensive and defensive strategies, and he just wanted his players to be more intelligent than the opposition. He felt if they were more intelligent, knew more about the game, knew more about what other players' responsibilities were on given plays, sometime in the heat of battle, that intelligence would pay off and they would make the right decisions.
Brown's gridiron vision gave birth to modern-day staples like film studies and playbooks.
He was the first coach in the history of football to actually assign playbooks to the players, and they really had to know that.
It was very simple in the beginning, but each day it got a little more complicated each time. And It's something you never forget. This is the academic side of football.
But Brown's playbook contained more than just diagrams. It also laid out his expectations off the field.
You had to write down the different principles that he had about language, being polite, being honest and courteous. He went down to the minute details to train the team.
He believed in educating, the total person. Yeah, he was going to make them excel in football and make them take notes and make them study film and make them do all those things, but he expected that from them off the field as well.
And do you know, of all of our 43 people, every one of them graduated except one.
Brown's organizational genius extended to the practice field.
He would put on the board exactly what he wanted us to accomplish, and when he blew the whistle and we hit the field, we knew exactly what he demanded of each one of us.
Practices hardly ever lasted more than an hour and a half. Everything was planned out right down to the 5 minutes.
It was all just bow, 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 and it was all super concentration, and at the end of the practice, by golly, you knew you'd been through the mill.
Brown maximized efficiency by delegating specific jobs to his assistants.
He was one of the first coaches to have a coaching staff where each of the individual assistant coaches had primary responsibilities for certain positions and certain things during practices and certain assigned responsibilities during the games.
But while every coach had a role, the ultimate authority belonged to one man.
The discipline was done by Paul Brown. He didn't delegate somebody else to take care of that job. It was his job, and you respected his judgment.
His leadership was unquestionable. No one ever did anything other than what Paul Brown had wanted and did Paul Brown's way.
He was known as a dictator. He was known as a disciplinarian, a man that wanted everybody to abide by rules, and everybody here was scared to death of Paul Brown.
No one questioned his methods or his results. His first Ohio State team went 6-1-1, including a season-opening win over Missouri, a 33-0 upset of highly favored Southern Cal, and a 20-20 tie against Michigan, who the previous year had manhandled the Buckeyes 40-0. But the success of 1941 was only a prelude to 1942, the year Paul Brown brought Ohio State its first national championship.
The Los Angeles Coliseum was the scene of Ohio State's October 4th, 1975 showdown against the UCLA Bruins. After falling behind 7-0, the Buckeyes reeled off 38 straight points as they cruised to a 41-20 win. Archie Griffin led the Buckeyes with 161 yards on 21 carries, while quarterback Cornelius Green chipped in with 120 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns. Buckeye Classics, brought to you by the convenience stores of Speedway.
1942 was a magical year for Paul Brown and the Buckeyes. When it was over, Ohio State would have its first ever national championship. But the road to number 1 was not without setbacks. A 17-7 midseason loss at Wisconsin was particularly upsetting in more ways than one.
This game has often been nicknamed the bad water game because of the fact that so many of the players were ill.
I would say about 90% of our traveling squad was under dysentery.
One of those circumstances where everybody was sick and felt very weak, and it certainly affected your ability to play.
The United States, of course, at that time was well into World War II, and transportation was really at a premium. The Ohio State Athletic Department had to get a couple old Pullmans out of storage, and apparently the water had not been drained, and so a lot of the Ohio State players became quite ill drinking this bad water.
It was very frustrating because we knew we were better than the other team, but there wasn't a great deal we could do about it.
Perhaps even more upsetting was the fact that Wisconsin was coached by Harry Stoldrayer, Paul Brown's childhood hero.
He wanted to win that game so bad, but due to the circumstances, it wasn't meant to be.
But Brown and the Buckeyes bounced back and finished the season on a roll. Pittsburgh and Illinois were blown out. Michigan fell 21-7. The Buckeyes were crowned Big Ten champion, but one last challenge remained.
Well, after that 21-7 great win over Michigan, the Ohio State schedule was a little bit unusual in 1942 in that this is the only season since 1935 that Ohio State did not finish the regular season with Michigan.
The game was against the Iowa Seahawks, a service team made up of both college and professional all-stars.
But here you had Bernie Bierman, who was one of the great coaches of his time. You had professional football players, one All-American after another, and I thought we would probably get beaten in that game.
But we went out and killed them. We just run up and down the field.
Ohio State played tremendously well that day. They won the game 41-12. There was certainly no letdown after the great win over Michigan, and they probably played their best game of the season in defeating this Iowa pre-flight team.
That was the game that made us national champion. That was the game.
The resounding victory, combined with losses by number 1 Boston College and number 2 Georgia Tech, vaulted the Buckeyes to number 1 in the polls. It appeared that Brown was building a football dynasty that would last for years to come. But history held other plans. By 1942, World War II was raging, and young men throughout the country were being drafted into the service.
By 1943, most of the players in the 1942 team were, of course, either in Europe or Japan and the Pacific, and they were serving their country. But there's no question that World War II destroyed a dynasty in the making.
Decimated by the draft, Brown's 1943 Buckeyes were an undersized collection of freshmen known as the Baby Bucks. The young Buckeyes struggled to a 3-6 record, and Brown suffered through his first ever losing season. After the 1943 season, Brown himself enlisted in the service and was stationed at the Great Lakes Naval Training Center north of Chicago.
In Brown's absence, one of his assistants, Carol Widows, took over as the acting head coach in 1944. Again, because it was felt that Paul Brown would come back to Ohio State at the end of World War II.
But at Great Lakes, Brown was approached by the Chicago Tribune's powerful and influential sports editor, Arch Ward. Ward was trying to create a new professional football league, the All-America Football Conference, which would challenge the more established NFL. Ward knew the new league needed credibility, the kind a coach of Paul Brown's stature could provide. He put Brown in contact with businessman Arthur McBride, the owner of the budding league's Cleveland franchise. McBride offered Brown a job and part ownership of the team. After much deliberation, Brown agreed, and on February 8, 1945, Paul Brown was announced as the first head coach of the new Cleveland Browns.
There's no question that Ohio State could not match the salary that McBride was able to offer Paul Brown to enter professional football. But Paul Brown was not an individual that was really driven by money. In fact, when he took the head coaching position in 1941, he didn't even know what his starting salary was. He has said many times he didn't know what his salary was because it didn't make any difference.
The announcement came as a shock to many, but to others, the transition to the professional ranks was inevitable.
He was so creative, so imaginative, and had so many plans of things that he wanted to do that he eventually would have gone into pro football, but I think he would have stayed here for a number of years before he made the move.
This is a business now. This is not a collegiate sport. And I think with all the resources available to him, he saw an opportunity here, and if there was ever somebody that took advantage and made the most of an opportunity, I think it would certainly have to be Paul Brown.
Brown, of course, went on to an illustrious professional career as coach, general manager, and owner. In 1967, his name was immortalized when he was inducted into the Professional Football Hall of Fame. His 1968 founding of the Cincinnati Bengals only solidified his legendary status. But even in the pros, his Ohio State ties ran deep. His Cleveland Brown teams were filled with former Buckeye stars, such as Dante Lavelli, Bill Willis, Lynn Houston, and Tommy James. Paul Brown passed away in 1991, but his impact continues to be felt today on football, in Ohio, and in the lives of the people he touched.
He had a real impact on a lot of people.
He probably was, besides my father and mother, was the most influential person in my life.
I always did something innovative in my practice, and I think I owe that all to Paul Brown.
And while his achievements in professional football caused some fans to forget his brief stay in Columbus, history and the memories of those who lived it will forever bathe the name Paul Brown in scarlet and gray.
Paul is so much a part of the Ohio State legend. You bet he is. Paul Brown and Woody Hayes. Those are the two names that will always be associated with Ohio State football.
He kind of set the stage for all of us just to keep going, and who knows, how far it's going to go.
In addition to playbooks and film evaluation, Paul Brown is credited with inventing the face mask, transforming the passing game, and using intelligence tests to evaluate players. Indeed, Brown's drive for innovation was constant. For him, football was a science, the field his laboratory. Paul Brown always looked for ways to make football better and make better the men who played. For Buckeye Classics, I'm Archie Griffin. Thanks for watching.
For the most up-to-date Buckeye information on all 35 varsity sports, log on to the official website of the Ohio State Department of Athletics, ohiostatebuckeyes.com.
The Buckeye Hall of Fame Cafe is proud to support Buckeye Classics. Buckeye Classics, brought to you by the convenience stores of Speedway.
The excitement of sports lies in the uncertainty of the outcome, of watching the drama unfold before your eyes. At its most thrilling, the space between victory and defeat can be a matter of inches or in tenths of seconds. Sometimes it's both, and the result remains in dispute. The 1974 Ohio State-Michigan State contest was one of those games, and its final seconds will frustrate Buckeye fans for eternity.
November 9th, 1974, East Lansing, Michigan. The undefeated and top-ranked Ohio State Buckeyes versus the upset-minded Spartans of Michigan State. A Spartan Stadium crowd of over 78,000 witnessed what many observers still call the most controversial climax in the history of the Big Ten. Coming into the game, the 8-0 Buckeyes, led by All-American tailback Archie Griffin, had outscored their opponents 360-75. On defense, the Buckeyes were equally dominating, having surrendered no more than one touchdown in each of their last 7 games. Michigan State, on the other hand, was a mediocre 4-3-1, including a 56-14 drubbing at the hands of UCLA. The game looked like a mismatch, but the Buckeyes knew firsthand that the Spartans were not to be taken lightly, especially in East Lansing.
Michigan State was a different team playing at home than they were playing on the road. They notoriously are the spoiler. And man, if they're in a position to knock us off late in the season, which it typically is, up there, they're going to do it.
2 seasons before, the Spartans upset the Buckeyes, handing them their only regular season loss. This time, Coach Woody Hayes was so wary of the Spartans, he altered his team's usual practice routine.
We did not prepare for Michigan. Woody couldn't afford that. In fact, I don't know that we ever prepared for Michigan during the Michigan State week in any year.
Still, as they took the field, the Buckeyes sensed trouble.
The boos and the roar you just heard greet the Buckeyes.
I remember feeling like things are not right. There was a sense in the air that, I couldn't put my finger on it.
I remember warm-ups for the game was really weird. The fans were really almost vicious. You can't hardly turn around, you can't hear, they're yelling at you, everything you can think of, questioning your parentage, and everything that goes along with that.
The bench seemed like you were in the stands. That's how close the fans were to the team.
It's a nasty place to play. It's everything college football's supposed to be.
The raucous home crowd seemed to boost the Spartans' normal level of play.
We didn't expect them to be as good as they were. And quite honestly, they probably weren't that great of a football team because they weren't consistent through the course of the year. But they played great against us that day. It was a hard-hitting game from the get-go.
They had still, to that day, had a reputation that kind of like the Steelers used to be in the old days, as they lost all the games, but they always beat the bejeebers out of you because it was always a tough game.
It was a tough, hard-hitting. I mean, every time you got tackled, every time you hit, I mean, it would sting.
But I can remember getting hit 3 or 4 times and thinking, those are the 3 or 4 hardest hits that I've ever had. And those came in that game against Michigan State.
The Spartan defense in particular had come to play. Their physical style threw a wrench into the normally potent Buckeye machine. Numerous drives stalled. Field goals were missed, and turnovers, 2 fumbles and an interception were killing the Buckeyes' attack.
You can't turn the ball over, especially when you're playing away, especially when you're playing in East Lansing.
Ohio State's struggles on offense weren't their only concern. Their heralded Buckeye defense had been crippled by injuries, forcing them to adjust on the fly.
I think I was playing corner at the time, which was a position I shouldn't have been playing to begin with, rather than playing my safety position, but because of injuries, they decided to shift me around.
I think that Timmy was probably one of the greatest athletes I ever played with, no question. Smart, tough, very competitive. I've always loved and respected Tim because he's one of the few players that will play with pain.
I had a separated shoulder on one side and stretched ligaments on the other side and a knee. So I could barely run and I could barely hit. And, you know, hindsight being 20/20, you know, you take yourself out of the game, but I wasn't going to take myself out of the game.
Playing with will and determination, the Ohio State defense was stifling. In fact, the Buckeyes dominated play. But a last-second Michigan State field goal at the end of the half sent the teams into the locker room tied at 3. The score was a shock to everyone except Woody Hayes.
Woody was great in anticipating certain things during the course of the year, and I can remember him paying a lot of attention to the emotion of that game in 1974.
He tried to prepare us for it, and still, no matter what he said, no matter what he did, we didn't understand what we were going to be facing when we went there.
I can remember him throwing a plastic pitcher of water against the wall in our meeting room, trying to emotionally prepare us for that game, trying to get us excited, saying, hey, look, you can't take these guys lightly because they're just going to knock your head off. And he used those exact words. Woody knew what was going to happen, but we didn't heed Woody's notice.
Tied 3-3 at the half, the 1974 Buckeyes realized the hard-hitting Michigan State Spartans were trying to repeat their 1972 upset win. Any thoughts of easy victory had been abandoned.
Most of those games that year, we were up 28-0 by the end of the third quarter at minimum. So at that point, we weren't taking Michigan State lightly. I think Michigan State wore us down.
The offensive woes that plagued the Buckeyes in the first half continued. Their opening second-half drive stalled at the MSU 2, and the Buckeyes were forced to settle for a second Tom Clavin field goal and a precarious 6-3 lead. The score stayed that way until the fourth quarter when Ohio State safety Steve Luke recovered a Michigan State fumble.
The sprint out by Baggett, and he comes up the middle of 30, fumbles, and it's Ohio State ball! Ohio State ball!
The Buckeyes finally converted when Champ Henson's 1-yard plunge capped a 44-yard drive.
He gives to Henson, and it's a touchdown, Ohio! And they now have a 12-3 lead, and the Buckeyes take it in, finally.
The extra point gave the Buckeyes a 13-3 lead, a margin that usually assured victory.
If there was one characteristic of a Woody Hayes-type defense back at that time, or almost any time that he coached at Ohio State, it was that the Ohio State defense never gave up the big plays. If you're going to score against Ohio State, you're going to have to drive it and make it on a series of short gains. And it was pretty uncharacteristic of an Ohio State defense to give up the big plays. Yet in the last 9 minutes of that game, Ohio State gave up 2 huge touchdowns.
The first came with just 5:30 left when Michigan State quarterback Charlie Baggett stunned the Buckeyes with a 44-yard bomb to receiver Mike Jones. It was the kind of play the All-American Fox routinely snuffed out when healthy. But on this day, his injury-riddled body wouldn't respond.
I saw it coming, but not in time. And when I went to plant and do what I needed to do to run, just didn't have it, physically didn't have it.
The play brought the Spartans to within 4 points, 13-9, and put them right back in the ballgame. Back on offense, the Buckeyes tried to grind down the clock, but as it had all day long, the OSU offense struggled to move the ball. Forced to punt, the Buckeyes turned to All-American punter Tom Skladany, who delivered a 55-yard kick, which pinned the Spartans back on their own 12-yard line. The game was now in the hands of the Ohio State defense. On the first play, the unthinkable happened.
The running backs are Jackson and Bays. It is Jackson loose at the 30. He may go all the way. Jimmy Fox has a shot at him and misses him. He's going for a touchdown. Levi Jackson goes all the way for a touchdown.
Levi Jackson runs 88 yards. Who would have ever thought that anybody could do that against us late in the game?
Nobody never ran a touchdown against us like that before. I mean, not even 50 yards, let alone 88 yards.
I still see Levi Jackson running down that sideline. You keep a team in a game long enough, the momentum starts changing and anything can happen.
Jackson's run remains the second longest run ever against Ohio State. More importantly, it put the Spartans ahead 16-13. With just 3:17 remaining, the Buckeyes knew their national title hopes hung in the balance.
What I did with the guys was get them in the huddle, give them something positive to think about. We're going to do it. We're going to score. So let's everybody get on the same page. Let's hold hands right now. We go with the play.
Archie Griffin's 31-yard sprint to the Michigan State 40-yard line brought the OSU offense to life. With a sudden sense of urgency, the Buckeyes surged deep into Spartan territory.
I wasn't very optimistic when we started to drive, but then as we marched, obviously that momentum did build, and then with that, confidence started setting in.
Once I kind of led the charge and everybody else started to rally around what I was saying, and then the plays started happening.
From the Spartan 6, fullback Champ Henson drove the ball to within inches of the end zone. With Woody looking on and time running out, Henson tried again.
Griffin, Henson, and Bashnagel are the running back. It is Henson forging his way forward to about the 1-yard line. He didn't get in, I don't believe. Counting. 7 seconds. And are they going to give him a chance to get a playoff? They didn't give him a chance to get the playoff.
Or had they?
I was at that game, and I was seated right on the goal line where that play happened. And I'll never forget, one official raised his hands, touchdown. Another official came over and went like this, no touchdown.
The atmosphere was so electric in that stadium. I think the officials were intimidated, I really do. I think they felt as though they were almost afraid to make the calls the right way.
After Champ Henson didn't get in, I'm running up and down the side, up and down from the right tackle to the left tackle, trying to get the guys up.
It turned out later, I found that these guys were holding our players down, which is the thing to do. Why wouldn't you do it? I would do it if I was them.
We was hollering at the referees, but of course the clock was still running, and I was trying to get the urgency. Hey, there's no timeouts, the clock is still running. Get up, get up. And I'm calling the play. Patton one, I'm calling the audible all at the same time.
They got to the line of scrimmage, the ball was centered, and it squirted between Cornelius Green's legs. Brian Bashnagel picked it up and took the ball into the end zone. There was just total confusion everywhere. I think most people, players and fans and everybody alike, was what really happened. I mean, did we win or did we not win?
It took 45 minutes before the answer was known.
Ohio Ohio State opened up the 1952 Big Ten season against rival Indiana in front of over 70,000 fans at Ohio Stadium. Making his Ohio State debut was freshman Howard Hopalong Cassidy, who electrified the crowd, scoring 3 touchdowns as the Buckeyes rolled over the Hoosiers 33-13. Cassidy's career culminated when he was awarded the 1955 Heisman Trophy.
The final seconds of the 1974 Ohio State-Michigan State game were so chaotic, even the officials were uncertain of the outcome.
Nobody knew what happened at the end of the game.
I'd never seen anything like it, and I don't think anybody ever had, and they may never again. It was eerie. The mood in the press box was one of disbelief.
I think there was a stadium crowd that day of close to 80,000, and I'm going to estimate that probably 40,000 of the people were still in the stands 46 minutes after time had expired, just trying to find out who won this football game.
We were all in a holding pattern in the locker room for about 15 minutes because we thought we were going to go out there and play that last play.
I know that Woody was pretty adamant. He thought that we at least should have had the opportunity to run one more play. And he was pretty firm with that. He would not let us get undressed after we got into the locker room.
We don't know what's going to happen, but we know it's not good. You know, a lot of times when Woody would get mad or get upset, it was an act. You know, Woody was a great actor, but he was mad this day for real.
All of a sudden the door opens up and it's Wayne Duke, Big Ten commissioner. I mean, he slinks into the room, you know. He didn't open the door, he kind of like opens it and like slides in, you know, and well, Woody's like steaming by then, you know.
And we were told that Michigan State won the football game, and it was upsetting. And our guys were upset. Coach Hayes was upset. He was really upset.
Woody had the commissioner of the Big Ten, Wayne Duke, had him by his lapels and had his feet off the ground and banging him against the locker saying, what do you mean? You know, you can't overrule this.
Duke's official explanation was that time had elapsed before the final snap, but Hayes would have none of it.
All I heard was this big crash into the locker, and I heard, we better not lose this game. We better not lose this game because of that. Now, what are you going to do about this, Wayne Duke? What are you going to do about this?
And finally, Wayne Duke says, I can't talk to you, you're delirious. And Woody said, you're right, I'm delirious, and went after him.
The thing that Woody hated more than anything else in life is when he felt like he was getting cheated of something. And it wasn't necessarily for his sake, it was for the sake of the team and the players. He just felt like he was getting cheated, that it was the officials that were cheating us. And of course, you know how Woody felt about officials.
One of the coaches, Coach, your heart, remember your heart. And he took his medicine out and threw it against the wall and said, I want to die.
There was no gray area for Woody. It was either right or wrong. And once he saw that, you know, we were on the right side of things, he could not understand why it couldn't be overturned and why we didn't win that football game.
That's what I loved about Woody. Woody fought for us. Ottie was extremely fair. I mean, he'd get down on you, he'd call you all kinds of names. If he felt like you were cheating yourself or cheating the team, he'd let you know about it. But on the other hand, if he thought that you were doing the right thing and you were giving the best effort, well, then he'd tell you about that as well. Well, games were exactly the same way as he would treat you as a person. And that is, if he feels like he's getting cheated, he's gonna go off the deep end with it, and he's gonna fight for us. He's gonna fight for all of us.
Dissatisfied with the officials and the commissioner, Hayes decided to take matters into his own hands.
So then Woody came into our locker room and tried to get a group of players together to go over into the Michigan State locker room to beat them up. We were, you know what, if we couldn't beat them on the field, we were going to beat them in the locker room.
He was ready to do it. I mean, the whole team, really.
We had a bunch of guys ready to go. I was around, I'll go.
But our cooler minds, everybody's cooler minds, including Coach Hayes, has prevailed, and we were upset.
Can you imagine Ohio State going over and fighting Michigan State in their locker room?
I don't know what that's going to do, but that's the old school move. You lose the game, I guess you want to fight by now.
But as much as the official decision seemed unjust, the Buckeyes knew that they deserved much of the blame.
We put ourselves in our own situation that we should have, never gotten ourselves into.
Typically, we would not have been in a position in that game, in any game, where a long run like that would have beaten us.
They were fired up
for us, and I think we didn't take them as seriously as they took us.
In spite of his protest, Coach Woody Hayes knew the final responsibility was always his.
He always felt like he could have coached better, and he always questioned himself, what could he have done better? And I really respected Woody for that.
The 1974 Ohio State-Michigan State game also highlighted a strange irony. From 1972 through 75, Ohio State never lost to Michigan, but they lost twice to Michigan State.
Probably when it's all said and done, that's probably the game that I would have feared the most had I known any of those games up in Michigan State. I would have feared the most if I had known what the results would have been.
Every time I think about it, it makes me sick. You know, because that was our game. That was our game. We were number one in the country that year. So, yeah, that was a bitter pill to swallow.
That hurt, and it's the one that got away from us. But in order to have a national championship team, you've got to win those, and we didn't get that done.
That game, you have dreams about that game. Nightmares would be more appropriate, yeah, nightmares.
The 1974 Buckeyes had little time to mourn their loss to the Spartans. 2 weeks later, they faced Michigan with the Big Ten title on the line. Ohio State regrouped and beat the Wolverines 12-10 on the strength of 4 Tom Clavin field goals. Clavin's kicks sent the Buckeyes west to a 3rd straight Rose Bowl, their 5th in 7 years. For Buckeye Classics, I'm Archie Griffin. Thanks for watching.
For the most up-to-date Buckeye information on all 35 varsity sports, log on to the official website of the Ohio State Department of Athletics, ohiostatebuckeyes.com.
The Buckeye Hall of Fame Cafe is proud to support Buckeye Classics.